Hello and welcome everyone to the fourth series of the Corpus Curiosum lecture series, where we aim to stimulate critical thinking in neuroscience through engaging with early career researchers and fostering discussions. We do this through three core values. We support early career researchers by enabling collaboration and creating a supportive environment at eye level. We embrace diversity by fighting intersectional inequalities and amplifying underrepresented voices. And we're accessible. We are advocating for open science and ensuring that everyone can join our events, which is why they're free and accessible for everyone from anywhere in the world. We are proudly sponsored by the International Brain Research Organization and the Federation of European Neuroscience Societies, which have been generously supporting this series. And we're also, for the second time in a row, proud awardee of the Eyebrow Diversity Grant, which testifies, our engagement in diversity, in having representation within neuroscience from different sexes, from underrepresented voices within the global South, which is one of the core values that we stand for. And a little bit about us. So it's the three of us: Ines, myself, Faisal, and Alba. We come from three different career stages. We are based in the UK, Switzerland, and Spain, and kind of like our diversity within locations, but also in our academic position right now reflects also the different stages that we are encouraging to join and to participate in our debates and our lectures. A little bit about you guys. So we have attendees from over 45 different countries, which include places like Australia, India, El Salvador, Argentina. So really like a broad spectrum of countries. And we hope that in the future, this map can get even darker, that we have people from even more countries joining our series. All of this would have not been possible without the support from our ambassadors, which are spearheaded by our amazing community manager, Mariela Trinchero. And we have people from Africa, North America, South America, Europe, Asia, acting as ambassadors, which means that they kind of amplify and promote Corpus Curiosum in their respective communities, within academic institutions and beyond. And really, these people have been doing an amazing job. And if you're interested in this kind of work, you can always reach out to us. We'll have similar programs, some ambassador programs running in the future. So do not hesitate to contact us in case you're interested. And now a little bit about our speaker. So born and raised in Curitiba, Brazil, Thiago Arzua is now a postdoctoral scientist at the Columbia University in New York. Before that, he completed his PhD in neuroscience at the Medical Center of Wisconsin and a bachelor's in biochemistry at the University of South Florida. Currently, he studies how trauma gets passed through multiple generations. He's also the co-founder of Black and Neuro, a freelance writer about everything brain-related, as well as a science policy ambassador. And today, Thiago will talk about the very, very interesting topic of Black and Neuro challenges in research and medicine. So thank you so much, Thiago, for joining us. And yeah, the stage is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, first of all, and thank you so much for Corpus Curiosum for inviting me. My name is Thiago Arzua. I am a postdoc here at Columbia University, but today I'm really coming more as one of the co-founders of Black and Neuro. We'll go a little bit in depth about the organization later on, but this talk in general will talk about some of the things that we call neuroracism. So some of the ideas and thoughts that have been really prevalent in the neuroscientific community surrounding race and different topics around that. Just as a brief outline, we're going to go back to the Enlightenment times and very early on, as far back as science was first created, to see how early scientific racism played there. I'll talk a little bit about phrenology and some of the 1800s justifications for slavery and such. I'll spend some time in the eugenics and racial hygiene movements, but really the majority of what I have for you today will be on medical and AI biases, in the present time neuroracism that we see. As I mentioned, scientific racism really started when science started. If you remember from high school, all these gentlemen, they're very important, both historically and for science itself. But given that they are representing a very specific division of population, so these are all white European men, they had all their preconceived notions and all the preconceived biases. And I tried to summarize them. I apologize for using a little bit of humor. I know this is a very heavy topic, but I try to make it a little lighter. Robert Boyle, who you might remember from chemistry classes, one of his original ideas was really the first, there is no difference between humans, there is no color. However, white people are better. Boyle had a very interesting idea that only white people with certain diseases will become Black. So it was problematic to begin with. Linnaeus, who you might remember from your biology classes, he was very famous for categorizing species. He also tried to do that to humans, and he came up with 5 varieties of humans. Benjamin Rush was a little bit more on the nose. He said that Negroidism was something that could be cured, so it was basically a disease. Thomas Jefferson was one of the pre-Darwinian racists. He used to think that there was a clear evolution between Black men and white men in his mind. But things get really interesting with Leclerc and some of the later on people. Leclerc himself was obsessed with Adam and Eve, and most people were at the time. Even these natural philosophers or scientists, they really thought that there was a clear beginning to humanity with 2 people. What I think is fascinating, just as a side note, is that before this post-Renaissance obsession with Adam and Eve, where we see depictions of them being very white, very Caucasian looking, most of what we had was a depiction, like from the churches in Ethiopia and Africa, of Adam and Eve being brown or Black. So I just thought that was very interesting because Leclerc, along with many other people at the time, were completely obsessed about this beginning of humanity. Schopenhauer had this theory about cold weather was what brought everyone together, and it's the reason for civilization. Therefore, anyone living near the tropics is clearly doing something wrong. Cuvier took Linnaeus' categorization and actually decided there was only 3 types of human. And Maynard just said, really, there's just Black and white people. I know this is a very reckless summary of their thoughts, but it gives an idea that all these people who were doing not just biology, not just neuroscience, they were doing something much more broader. They all brought these ideas with them. And moving a little bit forward in time, we get to Samuel Morton, who really was the main, maybe the father of craniometry, the study of the sizes of skulls and what that might mean for evolution or for humanity as a whole. And alongside Josianath and George Gliddon at the time, they were really trying to categorize and to really separate humans as you would do with species. We'll see this over and over again, this attempt to make boxes or to make binary distinctions. And Broca, who most of you might know from the Broca area in the brain, actually had a scale. I don't know if you can see really well here, but he basically had a scale based on the color of the skin, and he thought that the intelligence of these people would change based on that. So we see that even very early on in neuroscience, there's already a problematic trying to distinguish people here. And then we finally get to phrenology, which really, the more you look into phrenology, the more you think and try to study, you realize that it was a complete fad. It was just a trend. It didn't last for a long time. It started around the 1800s with this book called The Constitution of Men by George Combe. And Combe really was, I don't know any better word for this, but he was very culty about this. He kind of toured the world talking about phrenology, kind of giving away the phrenology evangelic kind of. And you can see the appeal in this. There was a form of predicting of behavior, like if you could measure your genuine husband versus your unreliable husband, there was this idea that you could know the future, basically. And it's something that we still see nowadays with a lot of the technologies that are still present. But because this was the 1850s, even Combe himself, he was an abolitionist, or at least a version of that. And one of the quotes from his book was that mild, docile, and tameable Africans, if emancipated and justly dealt with, would not shed blood. So even at the time where the abolition of slavery was already very present and there was already a fight for it, people who were trying to support that movement still brought in these very racist, very problematic ideas. And a lot of the neuroscientific community at the time, or I guess the early neuroscientific community at the time, took that. And when we get to the 1900s, it's where things get very, very heavy. And I think it's not an exaggeration to say it's some of the worst of humanity. It is interesting, and it's, I think, worth pointing out that a lot of the eugenics movement happened not necessarily in Nazi Germany, or didn't start necessarily in Nazi Germany. So these two books, The Rising Tide of Color and The Passing of the Great Race, were both by American people, and they passed down one of the thoughts that is still very present in society today, that white people will be supplanted, that white people will be snatched away because everyone else is breeding with each other. These very, very problematic ideas that unfortunately are still present. And this is actually, if I'm not mistaken, from Kansas, where they were trying to register human pedigrees. A lot of the ideas around eugenics had to do with the intellect or a betterment of society. And unfortunately, that is still something present when we see talks about like designer babies with CRISPR and whatnot. Another important distinction, or another important point to make, is the decision Buck v. Bell that happened in Virginia, when basically the Supreme Court at the time decided that decided that forced sterilization and the genetic inferior children could be would not be deemable or acceptable. So basically, it opened up the gate of a lot of the actual eugenics movement that we see in the US, a lot of forced sterilization, especially in the West, and a lot of the kind of justifications that we saw for this right up until Germany. I think a lot of the things that we see today and nowadays surrounding eugenics has to do with Nazi Germany, and I understand the appeal of this, but it is, I think, fascinating to me how it kind of started in the US. And here I have two different posters. I didn't want to show anything that heavy surrounding the 1930s and 1940s in Germany, but on the left here, you can see, I don't know how to pronounce this, but basically a house to try to birth more Aryan babies. And here's something that sounds completely horrible, but it's basically an ad saying that someone suffering from a hereditary disease is costing the community. Unfortunately, a lot of these ideas are still present, even if they're present the worst corners of society. But I thought it was interesting to see how this obsession with like purity and obsession with a higher intellect was so prevalent. And really, after World War II, what we saw was not much of a change in American culture. These were still the days of the civil movement era, so people were still fighting for their basic rights. And I think one of the great examples of how prevalent, or I guess how acceptable it still was to talk about some of these issues, George Rockwell, which was actually the founder of the American Nazi Party, was invited in 1966. So this was 20 years after the war ended, to give an interview to Playboy. And while I'll say that, yes, the magazine itself is already problematic and the interviewer tried to confront George Rocco's ideas, one of the phrases that sticks out, and I don't recommend anyone going to read this interview, it's absolutely horrible, but the idea of heredity and this, what he calls scholastic averages. So the idea of intellect and superior intellect was still very present, and especially the idea of like passing this down to the next generations. And unfortunately, this really never stopped. These are 4 different examples of books that came in the last few years, each one problematic in its own way, but basically trying to measure or to come up with a numerical number for why are some countries poorer than others, why are some people acting differently. So a very big obsession about how we can quantify the human experience, and more how can we improve human intellect beyond anything. And even in nowadays science, we still see this. So this is a paper that was only retracted in 2020, but it was published originally in 2012 that tried, this wasn't an original research paper, it was an actual review, but they tried to argue that the pigmentation of the skin would induce aggression and sexuality. So basically, all the way to the 1800s and the justifications for slavery and for a lot of the horrors that we saw in the world at that time, there were still researchers trying to find that, or to find a reason for that. So before we move to present day neuroracism, before we go to some of the unfortunate new things that have been happening since then, I wanted to just summarize some of these prevalent ideas that have been with us since the 1600s. Some of them were the human classification that I mentioned in the beginning. So this idea that there's maybe different species of humans, or just different types of humans, whatever word you want to use. The other one that is very, very present still is the deep desire to predict behavior, to predict human behavior. Phrenology itself started more as a criminology field than anything else, and unfortunately, we still see some of that today. The idea of biological disposition is still present, and something that we saw throughout these movements, and the obsession with intellectual superiority that I mentioned before. So with that, now that we have an idea of, unfortunately, where history was, I wanted to see how is that translated to patients? How is that translated into present day clinical contexts? And unfortunately, this next section of the talk is a little bit hopeless sometimes, and I'll promise I'll bring a little bit of hope into the end. But this is a study done in 2016 with medical students. So what they're asking here is basically asking first, second, third year medical students and residents a few beliefs about biological differences between Black people and white people. And some of these are very problematic. So the idea that Black skin is thicker than white skin, the idea is that Black people have strong immune system. And you can see that this, even if it's not super prevalent, is still very much around. Again, this is not even 10 years ago. And you can see that some of these are real. So being less accessible to heart disease, we'll go a little bit into that, or the fact that blood coagulates in different rates. Some of these have an actual biological explanation. They might have even biological backing to it, but it's just very telling how we're still here, how we're still bringing some of that very old racism. Part of this can be even studied as far as how we interact with faces. So this is a study done 2-3 years ago now, where they were basically trying to see if people would notice that someone's suffering depending on their skin color. And what we see here is that basically the perception threshold for Black people was higher, meaning that between a neutral phase and a very painful phase. It took longer for these participants to see the beginning of pain than it took for white people. And even if you inverted the image, even if you grayscale the image, this would continue. So there's a deep ingrained social awareness of this, or learned behavior of not seeing pain when pain is present, or seeing difference in pain depending on the skin color and the features of the face. Unfortunately, in the clinical practice, that translates to some of the most horrible things is the lack of analgesics, and less likely to receive opioids, especially in the US, when facing cancer. So a lot of cancer care surrounds pain medication, and unfortunately, Black patients receive less pain management compared to white people in the US. And in labor in general, Black and Hispanic women are less likely to receive an epidural. This has clear effects. So in cancer itself, the Black people in the US have the highest mortality rate and the shortest survival group of any racial or ethnic group. And surrounding pregnancy, there's a 3 to 4% or 3 to 4 times higher maternal mortality rates. Pregnancy itself, to me, is one of the best case studies of how this confusion between what racism, systemic racism in society is, and what a biological deterministic view of the world is. So I mentioned this 3 to 4 increase in mortality rates. But when we go and try to see the surrounding environment, so this is a very, very comprehensive study report done, if I'm not mistaken, 2019. So it's looking at different demographics and different cares surrounding pregnancy, and you can see that there is an increase in there's an increase in no prenatal care in African-American Black women. We see a higher number of people with private insurance, and as I mentioned, this translates to, unfortunately, a higher mortality rate. One of the best quotes that I got from the report that I think summarizes this really well is that the label Black is a social construct, but if anything, racism and now race is what increases Black women's risk as far as pregnancy goes. I also mentioned opioids a few minutes ago, and I'm sure you were aware of the still ongoing problem that the US has faced because of the opioid epidemic. If you were a few years ago paying attention to the headlines and to what the mainstream media was talking about this, one study that came in 2015 looked at Black and white mortality and saw that Black people were dying less. I don't remember what exact newspaper it was, but there was a big headline saying that Black people were dying less because they were getting prescribed less opioids, almost finding a silver lining to this. However, since then, there's been a very, very traumatic increase in mortality involving synthetic opioids. So this is a little bit more updated, and you can see the gigantic discrepancy between the death of Black men specifically with synthetic opioids. So I do not have an explanation. The authors of this second study also don't have a clear explanation. I think it'll be impossible to find a single reason for this. But some of the theories are basically that while Black people were not prescribed as many opioids in a clinical setting, and therefore didn't suffer this first wave of mortality rates. Now that there are synthetic opioids, things like fentanyl, on the streets, unfortunately, because of all the other societal and cultural and economic reasons, they are more accessible, if anything. But this, I think, shows a great example of how complex these things are, how none of these problems that we'll see will have an easy fix, or none of them will have an easy answer either. There's complexity to all of this. Moving a little bit more towards like the neuroclinical side of things, I don't know if you remember the Ice Bucket Challenge. It feels like it was a lifetime ago. Um, it was a challenge made to raise money and awareness for ALS. In 1 year, they were able to raise $150 million, which is great. However, and this is something that was new to me before I started doing this research, there is a gigantic racial and ethnic difference in ALS cases in the US. And sorry for the parenthesis here, but I apologize for using so much US-based statistics. It is very hard to find more global statistics for a lot of these things. So apologies for the US-centric view of this talk. But the same year that the Ice Bucket Challenge was around, this paper came seeing the racial and ethnic differences in ALS cases. And again, it's a great showcase and a great example of complexity in these things. So the study of all the 5,000 cases that they found, 75% or so were white people. And unfortunately, what that does, it's even though the data is sound, what it does is it validates this belief that ALS is a white people disease, or that there is something ingrained and biological about this, when in reality, and they even discuss this in the paper itself, but it gets lost on the headlines and on the communication of the paper, the chances are that people are just not getting diagnosed with it. So some of the people that are working towards this are the amazing people at IMLS and the Many Shades of ALS teams. I highly recommend you go check their portal and all the work that they've been doing. For this and for some of the other parts of my talk, it's very hard to find a good visual example of something. So I grabbed quotes. I think they feel really personal, and you can see how this translates to human beings. So this is a quote from a text or an essay that Dr. Carter wrote, talking about one of the patients that just got diagnosed with ALS. And I think I just want to highlight, as she prepared her supply, so as the physician was preparing her supplies, the patient asks, "Is there a test for this?" And that physician at the time said, "No, not for you, because it doesn't run the family." Ms. Turner herself, the person being spoken about this, actually had the SOD genetic mutation. So ALS is about 90% unknown reasons or unknown causes. However, there is a 10% familial component to it, and a lot of it has to do with SOD, which is just a simple genetic test. So not only there is this idea that ALS is a thing for white people only, therefore there is no test not for you. Even the access to genetic testing is something that is highly, highly difficult in the US and likely worldwide. We will do two more examples. I hope you can see that this is a systemic and spread problem throughout neurological diseases, but on the topic of autism spectrum disorders and just neurodivergency in general, we see a good trend of decreasing numbers. So this is a graph showing the prevalence ratio of white kids versus Black kids when they get diagnosed with autism. So we see that it's becoming more common for Black children to be diagnosed with this. At the CDC, so this is a slightly older study, but the CDC has had a lot of guidelines surrounding diagnosing and just treatment in general. I think it's fairly certain to say that a lot of these barriers have nothing to do with neurology itself or nothing to do with neuropsychiatric problems themselves. There are familial barriers, so it is hard to negotiate the resources to raise an autistic children or children with autism, my apologies. There's cultural barriers. I do not come from the US, and I know that there are different, in my case, I'm Latino, and I know that there's different Latino beliefs and deeply problematic Latino culture of being, just being tough and just figuring it out by yourself. And I know that there's similar conceptions or similar beliefs in other cultures here in the US as well. And there's also clearly structural barriers, so access to healthcare, access to even just educational policies themselves. Again, I think a quote might be better than any kind of statistics. So this is from a research article called "We Had to Keep Pushing," which is trying to see the perspective of caregivers. I won't read the whole thing. I'll leave it here for a little bit, but I think the main part of it is the pediatrician really kept coming with any excuses to not diagnose this person. I'll leave that for a second. And then finally, and once again, apologies for the US-centric view of the talk, but with the COVID-19 pandemic, what we saw was a gigantic increase in the death rate of Black people compared to white people in the country. So this is, for COVID standards, slightly outdated. It's from March of 2021. It's been harder to get more advanced data or more updated data since then. We'll see that as much as they could grab data, it was a 1.44 times increase. And this was very much across the whole country. Some of those were more proportional. Some of those are less proportional. You can see, can try to see some of the geographical and historical reasons for some of this. But I think in general, there was this deep divide. And I think of all the topics that I searched about about this form of medical racism, I think COVID might be the most infuriating one because it is completely and directly preventable, and not just with, systemic changes. It was, and people are starting to realize this now, it had a lot to do with this device here, these pulse or finger oximeters, because, and this was already known before COVID even hit, they don't work as well in darker skins. So what we see here is that basically Black people had a lower chance of getting or receiving treatment when their SO2 dropped below 94%. And this was all known already. This was all preventable. And I think it also highlights something that I haven't mentioned yet, and unfortunately I don't have a slide for. A lot of the data that I have, a lot of the data that is available is very binary, it's very categorized in little boxes, when in reality, one of the main problems of racism is colorism. So you'll see this in media, you'll see this in journalism, you'll see this everywhere. The darker your skin, the more likely you are to suffer some consequences. And I think this highlights this as well, even though statistically they're all in the same category. You can imagine that because this was a problem directly related to the skin color, colorism, if anything, was playing a bigger role. So now I think it's worth asking, what is neuroscience research itself and neurological research playing in this? We talked about the historical side of this. We talked about what it's looking in the medical field. There's even more that we could talk about in the medical field itself. There's disparities in stroke, there's disparities in skin cancers. I think in general, I hope I could give you the idea that basically, because this is so ingrained, because this is so systemic, it is playing a role everywhere. And in neuroscience research, it is very much the same. These are two papers that came out fairly recent that I really, really enjoy, and they give a framework, if anything, to start to understand how these racial biases are deeply coded inside research. So on this side, it's the framework that Achuta Kendambi used for his paper, and it's basically seeing three different types of biases. One, physical bias, which is very similar to what we just saw with the pulse oximeter. One, computational bias, so this is basically the data sets that we have available. And then the interpretation bias, so basically how we check the data, how we analyze data. Kate Webb in her paper also looked at something similar. So here, they're using a different term of confounds, so basically racialized and lived experiences alongside the phenotypic bias of some of these things. and the interpretation of data. So these are different papers. I highly recommend you go check both of them. But I think there's a lot of overlap here, basically seeing that there is this physical skin color problem or this skin color bias in how we do our studies, how we think of our technology. There's also just the computational or the data part of this. And then I think the interpretation is something that might be one of the hardest ones to fix. When we talk about physical biases, this is what it looks like. I'll play with this but without the sound. So you might have seen this already going around the internet. It has nothing to do with neuroscience research itself, but it's showcasing a soap dispenser that does not work with Black skins. It is just a small example. I think it's just a great visual representation of what it looks like. In reality, and let me pause this. Or no, actually, let me show or let them show the white paper itself could get the soap dispenser to work, but not the Black skin. In the clinic or in research practices, what that looks like is in I don't know how to pronounce this word, I apologize. In the technology that measures heart rate monitors by light. So if you have a Apple Watch or a smartwatch that has one of these green displays that you see every now and then, that's how they measure your heart rate. And when we see a few different studies looked in this, but this is looking at the face specifically. And we see that there is basically a difference in how much predictive power this technology has because it was not thought for Black people. That is exactly what this soap dispenser example shows. Very, very likely the technology as it was being developed was only tested in white people, was only used or thought by white people. And I think this has clear implications for research here. And it's also a great example of this physical bias. Another somewhat relatable physical bias has to do with EEG and natural hair. So if you're not aware, there's deep morphological, I think it's the word, changes in natural Black people or people from African descent hair. Not only is it just more coily, but there's different contact with the skin. And what that means is that a lot of times people who have their natural hair who have want to sign up for an EEG study or even fMRI study. In some cases, they're not allowed to because in the words of the physician, in this case, this hypothetical physician, the data wouldn't be good. I wouldn't be able to do this. There's a few examples online. Unfortunately, there's not hard data for this, but there's examples of researchers asking patients to try to make their hair lay flat without any product, which if you've ever seen someone with natural hair, you know that's impossible. And I promised I will bring a little bit of hope. So this is some work from Etienne, who's I think at the time an undergrad, who developed her own electrodes. So these, if I'm not mistaken, they're 3D printed, and you can see how they clip under the hair. So it's actually using these cornrows and using a technique or using something that is very common in especially African-American communities of styling your hair this way. And what they saw was that it basically works as well as the normal EEG or the conventional EEG, if you will. I think this is a little bit a splash of hope because it shows that once we start thinking about these problems, once we start actually like, oh, this has nothing to do with a predisposition, or it has nothing to do with some biological component. It literally has to do with we could develop better technology. It's another good example of this physical bias. Going a little bit more towards this database bias that we see. So this is a study that looked a meta-analysis of different neuroimaging studies. Because one of the other issues that we have is not just the lack of representation is actually the lack of just knowing what is being studied. So this looked at a few hundred papers, if not thousands, in the main neuroimaging journals. So this is looking at neuroimage, cerebral cortex, MRI, and EEG. And the red here represents all the studies that do not report their demographics, and the blue in the bottom are the studies that represent that, or that report their demographics. And here's just by technology. So a lot of the MRI studies, most of them are MRI studies, but some of them are also EEGs, as we mentioned before. And then the authors of this meta-analysis also were nice enough to give a table with all the papers, all the journals that were reporting their demographics and what the demographics look like. There's a few things to point out here. One is a study that 100% of people were white, or 99.98. This repeats itself a few times. We do see a few studies that are a little more, I guess, equitable, or at least better distributed. So a few of these are even including more Black people than white people. I went to see it, and it was not necessarily a study about any kind of disparities or anything like that. What I also think it's fascinating, and we'll get into that a little bit later as well, but if you look at the institutional demographics of these places, only one of them crosses the 10% inclusion of Black people in the recruitment. So these are all the universities that they were published. And you can see already a problem with the demographics here. And even better, I think you can also see that the cities that these places, or the cities that these universities are in, also have a complete different demographic. So one of the terms that has been used a lot to describe academia is this ivory tower. And I think this showcases a lot of this. These are institutions who do not have Black researchers or do not have Black physicians. Therefore, they're not enrolling Black people to their studies. And it's very questionable how much of these studies, like how much can these studies be predictive of? And it's unfortunately very similar for cognitive neuroscience. Again, it's a little bit hard to find great visuals for some of these things, so apologies for a lot of text here. So a few years ago, there was the coining of this term called the WEIRDs, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies as typical subjects for behavioral science. One more updated, so the coining of the term WEIRD happened in 2010, but a more updated study looking in 2020 saw that majority of the data, as I mentioned before, comes from the United States. Another great part of it is English speaking, and then almost the rest is European. And here we bring back that complexity and the just how much of this might affect research. Cognitive neuroscience specific, it has a lot to do with very difficult to describe and very complex scenarios that might not happen in other places, might not happen the same way. And what this shows me is that we might be making a lot of claims. If you ever seen like a bad science headline, you know what I'm talking about. It's the classic, like, coffee cures and coffee causes cancer. This is one potential explanation of why do we see this disparity? Why do we see so many cognitive neuroscience studies that are not representative of the real population? And then here on the right, I'm just highlighting some of the percentages. So it really is almost below 10% at this time of articles that are even mentioning minorities or mentioning the demographics. As of 2017, I think this is the most updated for cognitive neuroscience. Over a quarter of these studies didn't even mention the racial or ethnic composition of their population. So it goes back to that thing of we don't even know how bad it is, and it's very hard to know or to trust or to even want to do this kind of research when you know that you're basically examining a very specific portion of the population. And then the last step on this, this journey through neuroscience research itself has to do with fear conditioning as measured by skin conductance response. To me, one of the sad but very telling things was that I really tried to find a picture of someone with darker skin doing the skin conductance response, and this is just a screenshot from Google. So if you're not aware, skin conductance is a way to measure how we perceive and how we react to different stimuli. And it's a way to measure in humans. It's been used to measure how we detect threat, how we assess risk, how in a more clinical setting, how PTSD patients are reacting to certain stimulus. And then when I try to search for it, you can see there's not just a bias in the research, that's almost given, but even in the image and even in the trying to find an image of someone darker skin, it was very hard. And what unfortunately happens with this type of measurement is there is a cut, forgot the word, my apologies. There's a definition of when you're reacting to a stimulus or not. There's a threshold, and African Americans are less likely to meet that threshold. And we go back now to the interpretation of data. Fortunately, Dr. Cradlow, who published a few times on this, is very responsible in the way that she presents her data, showing that it's not just the fact that they're less likely to meet the threshold acquisition, they are actually just not being measured at all. So if you were, let's say, signed up for a study that measures how you react to loud noises or how do you react to sad images or anything like that, someone might look at the data itself and just interpret it as they're not reacting. There's a few papers that did that, and in the reality is just the technology is not being, it's not capturing the same thing. This all gets very complicated, specifically because it brings some of the other topics that we mentioned, some of the racialized environments in which these people might be brought up. So in the US specifically, there is a study showing that African-American people were less likely to react, they were more likely to react to threats, I think it was the study. However, once we see that there's this technology difference, it becomes very, very hard to actually pinpoint what is happening. And then I think it's worth, as we go towards the end of the talk, I think it's worth asking why do these things keep happening? Why are these biases still being propagated? Most of what I show for research-wise happened in the last 10 or so years, and it keeps happening. So I think it's worth trying to think, why is that the case? And I think these two studies are a great example of why this is it. So here on the left, you see a graph made by now Dr. Abiodun, and it's unpublished. So this is a still ongoing project that her and Dr. Castellan are doing, but you see basically the diversity of faculty in R1 universities. R1 universities are just the more research intensive universities here in the US. And you can see that for almost all of them, majority of the faculty is white, and there's very, very little representation. The other study that I think beautifully shows these biases and these disparities in research itself is a study which I think is still in bioRxiv, but it was looking at analyzing last names of authors. And I know that there's problematic in there. There's challenges in trying to find someone's race based on their last name. So I acknowledge that, but I think it's very interesting to see the actual data that they got. So here they're showing that there seems to be a slightly improvement. So there seems to be more citations of authors of colors. There's still majority of white authors that are being cited. These are the percentages by each one of the top neuroscience research journals, so going from 1995 to 2019. However, when we try to look deeper into this, what they did was basically trying to come up with the probability of a paper being cited. So if you look at the references of paper A, it's citing paper B. Chances are it's going to get cited. There's going to be a calculation that is embedded in here on how much this paper should be cited. What they found was that white people are more likely to cite other white people, and Black people are less likely to be cited, or less, I think 18% less likely to be cited than they should have been. So if you see the shadow here represents all the likelihood. So there shouldn't be any disparities based on like the type of journal or anything like that. And we still see this. And then separating by who's citing who, we see some of the, again, the complexity in this. And I think it's also interesting to see the networks that this forms. So chances are that you will cite someone that you worked with before, that you are simply familiar with the research. And what they showed based on this was that there's still a few clusters or a few communities of people being cited. And while there is representation, you can see that there's still, it's still basically not enough. And then it gets even more complex when you try to introduce gender to this. I think some of the original methods for which this paper like took advantage of came from a study that looked specifically at gender. So what we see here, it's a lot of data, but what it's looking at is basically based on these random draws, who's getting more cited, and it's basically divided by, again, these categories, and we can go back to the complexity of colorism and all of that later, and then divided by gender as well. And when you look at this, what it tells us is that Black women are very, very unlikely to be cited in this case. And the heat maps here, it basically shows the likelihood. And we see that they are kind of in the bottom right of this graph. And that is regardless of the paper characteristics, and it's regarding of the network that they're in. And I think it's also important to point out that there are very specific drivers for this imbalance. If you see these kind of red spots, so these are increased likelihood of citing, increased likelihood of being cited. So there's just disparities all throughout, and then it gets more complicated and more compounded when gender is involved. And once again, I should pause and say that yes, it's a binary version of gender. It's not ideal, but it's, again, it's a technological constraint that this study had. And then before we wrap up, I think it's worth going back to these prevalent ideas that I mentioned at the beginning, these historical ideas, because they're still here, because despite the fact that we don't use phrenology anymore, despite the fact that eugenics is maybe gone, hopefully gone, the ideas persist and they are still being studied in the same way. So this is from 2020, trying to see the cortical structure differences between East Asian and Caucasian men. This idea of predicting behavior, you might have seen the paper here. So this was very quickly pointed out as a neo-phrenologist type of study where they try to track trustworthiness with machine learning. The biological disposition is even worse. So this is a fairly mundane paper, if anything. So it's looking at the prediction of educational attainment based on their genetic disposition or their genetic composition. This paper was, a lot of quotes here, but it was cited, or it was mentioned by the Buffalo shooter that a month and a half ago killed a lot of people right here in New York, where I am. So even when these studies are not necessarily inflammatory or they're not necessarily trying to show anything. I think the drive and the obsession with these things, again, another neo-phrenology study looking at like political orientation based on machine learning. So I think even when these studies are somewhat done responsibly and they have no ulterior motives, I think there's still a lot more to be done to just like sit and think critically what the outcomes of publishing some of these things could be. Not disparaging by any chance any of these studies above. It's just that in the climate that we're in the climate that we've been for the past 500 years, these ideas and the obsession with these ideas, I think still drives a lot of the problems that we see. And I promised would end up on a very hopeful note. So I'm not, again, there is no easy answer here, but I think the answers that are already out there are already pretty great. I picked 3 favorite papers that I think address some of these, and you'll see some overlap here. So it was specific to autism, but I think the recommendations done by the authors are kind of overlapping for all neuroscience. So first 2 of them is to develop Black autism research at all career levels. Second one is to create social capital for Black autism researchers and practitioners. These 2 are very similar to what my colleagues in Black and Neuro published back in 2021. The first 2 specifically, like investing time, money, and resources. And the second one being mentors, like allowing these researchers to bloom and allowing them to thrive being who they are. And then lastly, this is a little more specific, and I think it's a little more comprehensive. This is the study that I mentioned before from a few months ago. The top 2 are, again, funding Black scientists and training personnel on these biases. But then the authors of here also go into a little more detail about the post hoc test that you can use, how to find some of the differences between confounds and real psychological effects, and really important, actually reporting your demographic information. And again, asking why certain minorities are being excluded when reviewing protocols. So in general, I think none of these things are easy. None of these things are an easy patch to fix. There's not one committee or one grant or one initiative that's going to change everything. But I think it's unfair to say that no one knows what to do. I think it's disingenuous to not appreciate that a lot of people have been talking about this for a long time, including all my friends and all my peers in Black and Neuro. So I mentioned in the beginning that I'm one of the co-founders. Black and Neuro is now a 501c3, so that's an official nonprofit here in the US that is aiming to diversify neuroscience by building a community that empowers and celebrates Black neuroscientists and Black neurologists. It started from a really sad place. So in 2020, we saw multiple headlines like these, starting with Amy Cooper, who went viral with the video when she tries to call the police on someone who's just watching birds. And then the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, of Tony McDade, of Breonna Taylor, and of George Floyd. All of these happened fairly in a short span of time. And what Black and Neuro came from was really from all the work that was done by Stephanie Page, Dr. Lee, and many others who first started Black in STEM, then started Black AF in STEM, where they came up with the idea of Black Birders Week right after the incident with Amy Cooper happened. And then the founder of Black and Neuro, Angeline Duke, tweeted this, "So when are we doing Black and Neuro Week?" And fast forward a few months, we were featured in Forbes magazine, talking about how we connected people from around the world. And we are now heading into our 3rd year, and it's very exciting to be part of this. We are now global, so this is like a little dot for every country that we've been able to reach and contact and create a connection with. And these are some of the numbers of things that we've done. Every event that we hosted, every connection that we brought forward, I think helps in the sense of just trying to make this more equitable, make this a little less horrifying than what majority of my talk was. And with that being said, we are only a week away now from Black Neuro Week, and it's going to start on Monday, July 25th. So for those of you who know, Black Neuro Week was how we started it, and it's now a free week-long conference. So we have thematic days. Monday is going to be Black Neuro Roll Call, so basically introducing everyone to each other. Tuesday, we'll talk about the across diaspora, so celebrating the Black Neuro community outside the US and the UK and Canada. Wednesday is the more talks about neuroracism, so we'll have a little more in depth about some of the clinical disparities that I mentioned here and some of the technology disparities. Thursday will be our Black Journey to Neuro, so highlighting mentorship initiatives and outreach. Friday, we'll have Black Neuro Careers, showcasing all the different types of careers that people can have with their degrees. And then Saturday, we'll do something called intersections. So basically celebrating the intersections of different identities of all the people in our community. And then Sunday will be a Black Enjoy, just sharing good things, just kind of relaxing after all that. So if you're interested, registration is now available, blackandneuro.com. It's fairly easy to get there. And I'll end on a very positive note by Bell Hooks. One of the favorite quotes I have from her is, once you do away with the idea of people as fixed, static entities, and you see that people can change and there is hope, I think that it resonates with academia a lot. So we've been doing the same thing for so long that it's hard for us to even imagine the ability of change some of the systems. The way academia is structured is still very much what people in the 1600s were doing. And a lot of the problems that we're facing today, I think, come from the fact that we're not able to see how this can change, and we're not very hopeful to begin with. So I appreciate your time.